Take a seat.
Let me turn quickly, though, to Asia and simply start by saying the United States has long had a very strong and dominant military but also economic position within Asia. This was obvious militarily with the wars in Korea and Vietnam, not necessarily that they redounded positively for the United States. The United States maintained a series of bilateral alliances across Asia that in many ways created an arc that the U.S. called the Arc of Stability around from the Aleutian Islands through Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, around to Diego Garcia, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. has maintained a strong naval presence in the Pacific. But importantly, the United States was also, I think, a force, and I may sound too American in this regard, a force for promotion of certain human values, promotion of economic development, the promotion of what many people call soft power, becoming a beacon for education for many Asians who wanted to study in the United States. So the U.S. presence in Asia was clearly much more complicated than simply that of a military hegemon throwing its weight around. And I think importantly, in Northeast Asia, the United States served as something of a balancer between China and Japan, keeping Japan from remilitarizing and spending a great deal of money on the military, which provided assurances to China, while at the same time pushing back against China so that Japan did not feel the need to expand its own military forces. And in many ways, I think it's possible to say that the United States won the Cold War in part by virtue of its tremendous support for what has become the Asian economic miracle and opening American markets to the export of Asian goods, while at the same time providing a military support base to try to keep some measure of security across East Asia. Now, what I think we've seen since then, and I'll go back to my three big themes, is starting with the incredible militarization of foreign policy under Bush. We saw the U.S. shift away from this complex mix of economics, military, education, culture, and the like, to a focus exclusively on the military. A couple of easy data to keep in mind. The U.S. spends more on defense than that of all the other nations of the world combined. This is not exclusively Bush's fault, but it certainly is a testimony to where the United States stands. The United States now has more musicians in its military band than it has diplomats, which says more, I think, about the United States. And again, this is not purely attributable to Bush, but also this year, the U.S. Army will add 7,000 more troops to the Army. That is more than the United States has as in its entire American Foreign Service. So that suggests something about the directions that American policy has moved in. But Bush himself took that already strong American military presence to a new level, particularly with his speech about the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, but also with the increase in military spending, with the CIA renditions policy, with black sites, with the Abu Ghraib scandals, with Guantanamo, and with the scrapping of an awful lot of existing multilateral institutions to which the United States was a member, replacing them by these so-called coalitions of the willing. In effect, the U.S. had a mission. If you would like to join, if you are willing, fine. If not, we will go ahead without you, because now the name of the game is you are either with us or against us, to repeat one of the oft-quoted phrases by President Bush. The United States, of course, as a result of the war in Iraq, first of all, well, let me back up. Following 9/11, the U.S. had an incredible measure of global goodwill. Le Monde had that very famous headline that we are now all Americans after the toppling of the Twin Towers. And in many ways, the world was quite ready to see the United States push back against Islamic fundamentalism and to go after the Taliban in Afghanistan. But Bush, in many ways, undercut that by the unprovoked invasion of Iraq, based on what many of us now realize was cherry-picked intelligence and a pre-commitment by the neocons, who were a very important part of the base, who had wanted for a long time to topple the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And there's been a huge drop in American popularity globally. I will not go through the 423 polls that I looked at, but Pew, BBC, a whole host of these multilateral polls show a tremendous fall-off in American support, popular support for the United States. One interesting indicator, though, is that now negative views of the United States outweigh positive views anywhere from 50 to 55%, and they've been rising, whereas negative views of the United States negative views have gone up and are at the 50 to 55% level. Positive views are in the 30% range, 38 to 28%. So positive views have dropped very considerably of the United States across the world, including in Asia, and big drops in countries that are normally very pro-U.S. Japan, Australia, the ROK, the Philippines, etc. Within Indonesia, with its strong Muslim population, the U.S. dropped from 75% popularity to 30% over a 6-year period. I guess the only thing to be said against this fall in public opinion is that the hardcore realists and neo-realists essentially take the position that public opinion doesn't matter. What really matters is how government leaders get on, how the militaries get on, etc. I would challenge that notion by pointing out that as East Asian governments have become increasingly democratic, a number of them, not least of which Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, have all gone through a lot of explosive changes in their foreign policy as a consequence of being seen as too close to or too allied with the United States. And this is becoming an increasingly important problem for the United States. Importantly, in this context, as the U.S. under Bush has moved toward militarizing its foreign policy in Asia, Asia has been moving almost in the opposite direction. Now, this is not to say that Asia does not have security problems, does not have tensions, does not have unresolved territorial issues, but basically no major wars in East Asia since the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. There's a very interesting datum up there that indicates the drop in military expenditures relative to GNP, declining from 2.6% in '85 to 1.8% in 2001, and parallel declines in most states in the proportion of the military budget that has been given over to central government as a proportion of central government expenditures. In fact, East Asian governments are generally spending less on the military as their economies go up than many other portions of the world, Latin America, the Middle East, most of Africa, etc. Now, there are clearly some genuine problems there. Many people worry about the modernization of the Chinese military. There is a relatively high level of spending for the military as countries get richer. But generally speaking, as one person was pointing out, when East Asian leaders tend to get together in multilateral forums, they are mostly talking about economic growth, about trends in trade, about problems of investment, increased cooperation. They're not talking about threats that one or the other poses to one another. And in fact, the climate in East Asia has broadly changed, it seems to me. It's true that U.S. military ties have gotten very good with a number of countries, with Japan, with Singapore, but these were also very good before Bush. And more importantly, I think, Japan's links have become increasingly militarized at the expense of Japan's overall position in Asia. Japan has moved far to the right during the time since Prime Minister Koizumi took over, which is almost the same time that Bush took over. South Korea, relations have gotten much worse, particularly during the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun regime. Current administration has tried to swing back more toward a pro-conservative, pro-U.S. position, but that's running into a great deal of difficulty at home. I would argue that relations with ASEAN have gotten, in many ways, collectively worse, in part due to the marginalization that the Bush administration has carried out toward ASEAN. China ties mixed, somewhat pragmatic. They got off to a dreadful start. They've improved in some ways. But as I'll suggest in a minute, the United States is largely schizophrenic with regard to China. Parts of American policymakers wanting closer ties, particularly in economics, parts, particularly in the Pentagon, worried about a China buildup and a China military threat. And the last point I would make, and I will talk about this as well, is that I think relations with North Korea and the overall handling of the North Korean nuclear problem have been a consummate disaster. I'm going to be very quick on Japan. I had more to say about this, but I want to simply sketch this for you. Essentially, Japan's position prior to the prime ministership of Koizumi had been to take a very low posture militarily. After 9/11, Koizumi moved very quickly to align Japan closely with the United States. Japan sent SDF, Maritime Self-Defense Force, ships to support the invasion of Afghanistan and the Indian Ocean. He sent a small contingent of troops to Iraq, even though they had to be protected by Australian soldiers. Thank you guys very much. He upgraded the status of the self-defense forces. He also put a massive aid package in place for Iraq. Now Japan has become headquarters to I Corps, 1 Corps. They've moved to Camp Zama in Japan from their base in Washington, the state of Washington, meaning that Japan is now part of the broader planning of U.S. military forces going all over the world, or at least all over the Pacific theater, which includes India and Central Asia. Japanese troops now participate in Operation Cobra Gold with Thailand and others. Japan shifted its position on Taiwan to make it much fuzzier as to whether Japan would or wouldn't support Taiwanese independence, or where it would support Taiwan in a possible confrontation. The Coast Guard has been expanded. There are a whole host of things that have happened. But the end result of this, I think, is that Japan is now talking about constitutional revisions and runs the risk, I think, of clear isolation in the rest of Asia. Koizumi was particularly problematic with his visits to the so-called Yasukuni Shrine, which alienated Japan from China and from South Korea, which felt that he was showing insufficient sensitivity to the issues of Japan's position during World War II, and was strongly criticized. But during the Koizumi administration, there were no summit meetings among the top leaders of Korea, China, and Japan, and relations deteriorated considerably.
Take a seat.